Do you believe in curses? Well, here in New England, we've had our fair share of them. We have the sheriff's curse, a sea captain's curse, even our baseball team had a curse placed on them. But we finally broke that one. But in an isolated part of Connecticut, one of the most enduring and celebrated curses has resulted in a small abandoned hamlet becoming one of the most intriguing places in the country. And the tragedy and torment that allegedly comes along with that curse is extremely strange. To understand the origins of the Dudleytown curse, we have to first return to 16th century England, where Edmund Dudley, an English administrator and financial agent to Henry VII, was beheaded by King Henry VIII on the charge of treason when he attempted to call to arms some supporters in the event of Henry VII's death. A pardon didn't materialize, so it was off with his head in August of 1510. His son John, Duke of Northumberland, and an imposing figure in his own right, planned a military coup to install the wife of his son Guilford, Lady Jane Grey, as the Queen of England. The plan failed, so after forcing him to renounce his Protestant faith, Queen Mary I had him executed as well. After serving only 9 days as queen, Lady Jane was charged with high treason and beheaded in February of 1554. It is supposed that at this time a curse was placed on the Dudley family, who would go on to suffer a tragic series of misfortunes. Another of John's sons returned from France after serving in the military and brought along with him an illness that spread among his officers and troops. The disease claimed the lives of large numbers of British soldiers and would eventually kill thousands as it spread throughout the country. One of John's supposed descendants, William Dudley, emigrated to Guilford, Connecticut during the Puritan Great Migration, where people from the wealthy middle class came to North America to live virtuous and devout lives. And if a few suspected witches were hung in Salem, well, that was the price of piousness. Soon after, other Dudleys followed: Gideon, Abiel, and Barzillai, and later Martin Dudley from Massachusetts, who, while unrelated, likely saw some form of kinship with his surname. They had arrived at a small hamlet in the woods that had been settled by Thomas Griffiths in 1738 and began to clear land for themselves. The land is canopied by a heavy forest with an extremely rocky ground. A series of mountains also greatly impede sunlight from reaching the land. It's no wonder, then, that the area was bestowed with the moniker, the Dark Entry Forest. The community, who intended to farm corn, wheat, and flax, began to grow in numbers, particularly after iron ore was discovered close by and became the primary yield of the area. Nonetheless, despite the newfound source of income, Dudleytown, as it was now being called, suffered from a lack of self-sufficiency, with no shops, churches, schools, or even a cemetery. Many necessities then had to be purchased in other nearby townships. Dudleytown residents would attend the Congregational Church in Cornwall Plain and used its cemetery to bury their dead. Timber was another source of revenue, as logs were burned and converted into wood coal for the Litchfield County furnaces, until the furnaces moved closer to the more industrialized towns, which eliminated the need for Dudleytown lumber. Even the iron ore industry ceased to exist, as the arduous trip down mountainous terrain proved too slow, dangerous, and costly. It certainly seemed that whenever things started to take a turn for the better in Dudleytown, some obstacle or abject failure seemed to follow. But there are also the strange sequence of deaths and peculiar happenings in the village to take into account, a relatively exorbitant number of them for such an isolated and sparsely populated area. Nathaniel Carter's family moved to Dudleytown in 1759 and lived in a home once owned by Abiel Dudley. Later, a pandemic raged through the town, claiming the lives of a relative, Adoniram Carter, and his entire family. Burdened by their loss, Nathaniel and his family soon moved to Binghamton, New York, where they built a log cabin and where it appeared the Dudleytown curse followed. They had moved into what was then called the Delaware Wilderness, where attacks on settlers by indigenous tribes were not uncommon. A year after moving there, Nathaniel's wife and infant child were slaughtered by natives and the house burned to the ground. When Nathaniel returned home and viewed the carnage, he was ambushed, scalped, and murdered. His remaining 3 children were abducted and brought to Canada, where his 2 daughters were ransomed off. The boy, David, would go on to live with his captors, marry a Native American girl, and later become Chief Justice of the Cherokee Supreme Court, as well as editor of the Cherokee Advocate. A man named Gershon Hollister was building a barn when he was allegedly murdered at the home of William Tanner, the neighbor of Abiel Dudley. It's labeled alleged because there's some speculation he might have fallen to his death. In the years that followed, Tanner, who lived to the ripe old age of 104, began to tell wild tales of strange creatures and demons lurking in the woods that would come in the night. With the rest of the Dudley family finally moving away, Abiel remained as the last remaining member, calling Dudleytown home. Before long, Abiel began to slowly lose his own mind as well as all his worldly possessions after a sequence of misfortunes compelled the town to foreclose on his property and sell it off in order to satisfy his debts. Abiel essentially became a ward of the town, but would not be the last to drift into insanity. General George Herman Swift, who served under George Washington during the Revolutionary War, suffered a terrible loss when his wife Sarah Fay was struck by lightning and killed instantly while standing on their front porch on Bald Mountain Road. While the chances of anyone being struck by lightning today is around 1 in 15,000, in a sparsely populated area in the 1800s, those percentages are exponentially higher. Soon afterwards, General Swift subsequently went insane before dying of natural causes. He too was in his advancing years. But the plague of insanity continued, with Swift being the third to succumb. Dudleytown began to take a dramatic downturn after the Civil War, when many residents packed up and moved off. But one of the more infamous post-war stories associated with the curse is said to involve the editor and founder of the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley, who had married a woman named Mary Young Chaney, who is said to have been born in Dudleytown. Leaving the area in 1833, she ended up living at a boarding house for vegetarians owned by a Dr. Graham, of Graham cracker fame. There she met and later married Greeley. Just prior to Greeley running for president against Ulysses S. Grant in 1872, Mary died of lung disease at their home in New York. 1 month later, Greeley himself died, and all electoral votes assigned to him were distributed to other candidates. When the population had been reduced to a handful of people, one of its few remaining residents was a man named John Patrick Brophy. The misfortune that devastated his family is stunning, to say the least. His wife succumbed to consumption, better known today as tuberculosis, after battling its effects for many years. Soon after her funeral, his 2 children took a walk in the forest and were never seen again. Shortly thereafter, their house inexplicably burned to the ground, and to put the finishing touches on the catastrophic series of events, Brophy himself disappeared into the forest and was never heard from again. One final chapter of the curse concerns Dr. William Clark, who came to Cornwall, embracing its surroundings and the quiet life there. Clark was a man of great professional credentials, becoming a professor of surgery as well as teaching at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons. He was also one of the leading cancer specialists in New York. Clark purchased 1,000 acres of land in rural Connecticut, which encompassed Dudleytown, for the purpose of building a vacation home for himself and his wife, Harriet. They would regularly stay there during weekends, and upon completion of the house, used it for holiday getaways and summer visits. All seemed well there until the year 1918, when during one summer's weekend, Dr. Clark was called away on an emergency in New York. When he returned home a day and a half later, finding the front door ajar, he entered the house to hear the sound of maniacal laughter coming from an upstairs room. There he found Harriet, who, to his horror, appeared to have gone completely and inexplicably insane, becoming the fourth to do so. Talk emerged that she too had reported seeing the same type of bizarre creatures emerging from the woods that William Tanner had 100 years earlier, going further to claim she had been attacked by them. Tragically, Harriet committed suicide shortly thereafter. Dr. Clark kept the home in Dudleytown for occasional visits there, and would remarry to a woman named Carita. They would stay at the Dudleytown residence while a larger home was being built for them. During that time, he and Carita, along with 41 others, formed the Dark Entry Forest Association in an effort to protect the entire woodlands area from being developed and robbing it of its natural state. Dr. Clark passed away in 1943 and Carita in 1948. Some of their children and families still live close by Dudleytown. Today, the abandoned settlement consists of crumbling foundations, stone walls, and former roads that are all but covered by overgrowth. Its cursed reputation has attracted thrill seekers, ghost hunters, and explorers from the four corners of the globe. But a more negative element was drawn, as satanic rituals were commonly held there, likely playing on its tragic history as a place where darkness seems to be the rule rather than the exception. The ghosts of Dudleytown include the sad spirit of Abiel Dudley, seen standing on the porch of his former home one day by a man who was passing by the ruins. He claimed the apparition of Abiel was completely transparent. Also Gershon Hollister, who appears as a shadowy form or in the manifestation of the sound of his distraught voice calling out for help. Then there was a group of teenagers exploring Dudleytown late one evening who claimed they were chased out by a shadow person who literally appeared right behind them even after they had returned to their car. The mysterious disappearances of those who venture into the dark forest continued in 1945, when a group of teenagers went into the forest there and never returned. Then in 1975, Susan Denham went hiking in the woods and vanished, never to be seen again. Animals tend to have a very odd reaction to Dudleytown, with many owners claiming their dogs refuse to enter the woods, while others become belligerent and disconcerted when approaching the abandoned town. Pets have allegedly gone missing in the Dark Entry Forest, with some still missing, and others returning home weeks later, bearing signs of extreme trauma. It's been speculated that Dudleytown sits exactly where the thinness in the veil between the physical world and the spirit realm exists, making it effortless for spirits to cross into our physical reality. Spurred by the wildly popular Blair Witch Project, the rumors of haunted land brought a new generation of thrill seekers to Dudleytown. Those who have entered claim a distinct heaviness falling over them, and many claim to hear the sounds of phantom footsteps, growls, screams, mysterious shadows, human whispers through the trees, and strange light anomalies that dart through the trees. Particularly disturbing are the reports of unnerving music drifting through the misty forest at night. It's often said that those venturing in experience an overwhelming silence that sometimes feels suffocating. Birds and animals are rarely heard in these moments. In a 1993 interview with Playboy magazine, actor Dan Aykroyd referred to Dudleytown as the most haunted place on Earth. Dudleytown had become such a magnet for people wanting to experience the paranormal that the planners for the Dark Forest Entry Association have forbidden trespassing on their property, eventually tiring of the incessant intrusions, vandalism, and disturbance to the ecological systems, mainly by intrepid ghostbusters and risk-taking teenagers, many of whom would end up becoming lost in the woods and needing police assistance to get out. As a result, the police department works closely with residents who live near Dudleytown in an effort to thwart trespassers who are typically cited several times a month. In 1999, they announced that they would no longer allow hikers on the land. Just as unfortunate is the fact that the forbidden quality of Dudleytown is what brings so many curiosity seekers to the vicinity. The Dark Forest Association watches motorists and pedestrians who use the roads surrounding Dudleytown, records the license plate numbers of trespassers, and then submits them to police. Did a curse actually follow the Dudleys from England to America? William Dudley was not, in fact, the son of Robert, Earl of Leicester, which he would have to have been to assume any hex placed on the family. Robert had two sons, one of whom died at a very early age, while the other moved to Italy where his own children remained. Therefore, any link between William and his sons didn't appear to exist. Mary Greeley wasn't born in Dudleytown, but in Litchfield, Connecticut. Some legends claim she was another victim of the Dudleytown suicide curse, but as stated, she passed from a lung disease. William Tanner's descent into insanity could easily be reasoned as a byproduct of his extreme old age. After all, he lived to the ripe old age of 104. His claims to seeing wild creatures lurking in the forest are considered by some to be a sign of his mental decline. The same could be said of General Heman Swift. Like Tanner, insanity might easily be explained by advancing age and possible senility. Nonetheless, getting struck by lightning, like his wife did, is still wildly improbable. Then there's Harriet Clark. What we know is that she suffered from what only is called a chronic illness for many years before taking her own life. Therefore, the nature of this illness could have been physical or psychological. Her mental state at the time of her husband's return was obviously unstable, and her talk of being attacked by bizarre creatures in the woods might have been a telling sign. But William Tanner claimed seeing the same beings. How unusual is it that two people, possibly sliding into madness a century apart, would share the same delusion? The town itself isn't really a town, but a rustic part of Cornwall. It was, at best, an atrocious location for agricultural pursuits, with a dense forest literally blocking sunlight, and rocky, hilly terrain at elevations exceeding 1,500 feet. Winters were harsh, and even year-round crops like apples would wither. The hills would certainly send heavy torrents of water cascading down, essentially washing away whatever crops had been planted, eroding the surrounding properties, and saturating the ground, resulting in a swampy mess. With all that in consideration, there is still an unusually high amount of suicides and mental afflictions for such a small population in such an isolated area. Some have surmised the mining of the burning of logs for wood coal may have released a host of airborne toxins that affected the populace in a very adverse manner. So while the idea of a curse might not survive objective reasoning, one can't deny that the many deaths and psychological afflictions could at least be declared unusual. It's not out of line to declare that Dudleytown was a place of extremely odd occurrences. Or perhaps it is merely a location that the very land it sits on has been stained by mysterious forces.